Yes, one at the side. Thank you, sir.
What advice do you give to a client who is faced with an attack quickly? What do they do? Who do they pick up the phone and talk to protect their interests?
Yeah, look, I think first of all, hopefully they've got an insurance policy, and then they'll have a raft of measures in place. So you'll have the IT security, and I'd call them first if they're in the system at the time. Then probably get the legal teams on the phone. Some of the problems are that they don't know who to call, so they sit there and don't do anything, and that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. So, you've got to get the ball moving. You've got to deal with it quickly.
Do the lawyers know what to do? Do the accountants know what to do? Do the PR people know what to do? Have they practiced? You're selling a product.
Yep.
Are you selling that instant claim support?
Look, I think the insurance industry's done a great job in putting together panels that are experienced in this situation. So, and we do panels because obviously there's conflicts. We don't choose somebody to join one of those panels if they haven't dealt with these things before, if they don't have specialists in that area. So absolutely, they know exactly what they're doing.
All right. Anything else? Just give us a sense, I guess, of are there organisations effectively that are setting up in this area, literally on call to deal with this independently? So do you want to talk a little bit about that? I guess people are interested in first response opportunity, or who are the organisations that kind of deal with this?
Yeah, look, I guess it's been a range of organisations. I think, you certainly got like loss adjusters are now trying to put in specialist arms to deal with this. Anyone in those sectors, so anyone who was in PR, law firms are all, they're seeing it as a new area of opportunity, and so they're all sort of beefing up in this space. But David.
So there are organisations that have been in the field for some time. There are some that are more recent entrants, ourselves included, and usually it's a fly to site offering, a subscription up front, but that requires preparation. And to the gentleman's question over there, if you've got to ask the question, it's already game over. If you haven't been put in place incident response, know who to call, know what your team is, make sure that those call tree lists that you have aren't a year out of date and that half the people have left the organisation.
Yeah, look, I'll just jump in on that as well. I think that's a great point. One of the things that we concentrate on from an underwriting perspective, when we first started this, we were looking at how do we identify a business that isn't going to be attacked, or what looks like a good risk. And the more you get into it, you realise that's just a ridiculous way to try and write this, because everyone's exposed, and I mean there certainly are better risks out there, but the better risks, we've now kind of shifted that to how do you deal with an attack, and looking at business continuity plans. Have you got one in place? How robust is it? When was it last tested? Is it constantly updated? Does it address cyber issues? And that's, for us, that's what makes a good risk. So they will know who to call.
And if I could just chip in, at national level, we're having exactly the same conversation. So while individual organisations need to prepare well for risk, the National Cyber Security Centre, for instance, has a dedicated incident response function, so that if an entity in New Zealand has a problem, they can go to them and seek advice. Now, we're working at the moment on a project to try and build that function a bit so that it's more accessible for a wider range of New Zealanders. But to do that, again, we're going to have to partner in really interesting ways with the sorts of panels that the insurance industry works with. And we've already done that in government. There's now a panel of suppliers across 7 different aspects of cyber security, from incident response through to the comms and legal stuff. That over time we're making sure that panel is as open as possible. It can be added to every 6 months rather than a sort of 2 to 3 year closed panel approach that often occurs with procurement, because as companies mature, we want to get them in that market as soon as possible and be able to provide those services both to government, but if you go and look on the Connect Smart website, you can find information about that panel if you're a private sector provider.
Okay, any other questions? Just give us a sense too around sophistication. Obviously this is that, you know, the sophistication level goes up presumably every year. The defences have to be, more, stringent than they were the year before. It's a kind of a cat and mouse game. So how do you sort of maintain, I guess, that response rate, and are companies, really being aware of that?
So intelligence, when I go and assess organisations, one of the things I look for is, are they subscribing to any intelligence feeds? Are they keeping up to date? Yes, certainly things change and things get more sophisticated, but the majority of the big breaches we've seen have been relatively simple.
Yeah, actually, it was interesting. I don't know if you caught up with the ATM one yesterday out of National Australia Bank. You don't even have to be particularly sophisticated. The Australian who managed to steal $1.6 million because he worked out that you could transfer the money from his credit card when it was effectively offline, so the cash was transferred across. Then he just simply withdrew it. And of course, when it came online, he was able to sort of, maintain ahead of that. Went on for months. Just a very, very simple breach. So you don't, you have to be very smart in some of these areas.
This is one of the complications. I think David's slide was very helpful because it broke into layers, the different places you have to treat this. So we've got physical risk. We have to assess networks to make sure they're properly built. We've got the software layers above that have to be well built. And I guess the really key problem, it goes to that acronym PBKAO, the problem between keyboard and operator, the human layer at the top. And that's actually possibly one of the most vulnerable areas. Almost all of the surveys that come back on cybersecurity risk show somewhere between 18 and 20% of the risk is actually an insider-based problem, so that it's people either unintentionally or maliciously accessing networks for purposes that they shouldn't be, and causing damage to the organisations they're in.
Can I just amplify that point? No show of hands, please. Mentally raise your hand if your organisation has a security awareness program. Put your hand down mentally if you don't have at least 7 different versions of that for the 7 different audiences that you need inside your organisation. Most of the time we see end user targeted things. It's the poster, it's the mouse mat, it's the pen, and that's about it. Or it's the splash screen that comes on that you're all supposed to read every time that you log on, but you never do. But there are so many other audiences within an organisation that need, when we assess them, that need to be there and on the program. And unless you're reaching out to those other audiences within an organisation, again, it's going to be game over.
It's a really good point. I mean, security awareness plans. I would figure probably less than 10%. What's your anecdotal evidence suggesting how many businesses would have that?
I'd say that from what I've seen, 20 to 30% have some kind of plan. It's usually the financial institutions that have invested more time in it. They're usually more ahead of the curve.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that, across the businesses we see. We've actually had surprising uptake in the SME end, and I think that's a component of they're aware they have an issue, and they're aware they don't have the resources necessarily to deal with it themselves. They're doing what they can, but they would like insurance there to sort of fall back on if that falls over. But those businesses aren't fully aware of all of their exposures. Certainly the bigger financial institutions are ahead of the game because they need to be, and they're probably more in touch globally. But yeah, it's very mixed across.
We'd see the same thing with SMEs here in New Zealand. So one of the things we did with the Connect Smart Work was actually a toolkit for SMEs on how to demystify cyber security. So there's a package there that we worked with Vodafone and Business New Zealand and ANZ Bank on putting together that breaks cyber security down into 4 bits of a warrant of fitness for a small and medium enterprise. Because very often the first question is, I just don't get this stuff. How do I deal with it, and how do I work on security with my team?
Finally, do you think we'll get to a point of some form of compulsory reporting on this eventually?
I hope so.
I
think it's important. It depends what form it takes. In the US, interestingly, they're now, we're talking about notification fatigue. There's been so many large breaches in the last 12 months. We talk to our colleagues there and they're like, oh, yeah, I've had 3 notices. It tends to be the first time, yeah, okay, you're doing something about it and everyone's vulnerable. But the second and third time, people are losing confidence. But then if it continues to happen, just from companies around, people are starting to switch off. That's a concern. So, we have to have a look at how we notify.
It's an exceptionally complicated issue because the evidence is quite mixed on whether mandatory disclosure or getting to a position where companies feel more comfortable disclosing on a voluntary basis is actually a better tool. And one sort of forces a shift. The second would hopefully deliver a different kind of security culture, but is much harder to achieve because it requires intrinsic motivation. The review of the Privacy Act that's underway at the moment has seen an announcement back in May that there would be consideration of a provision for mandatory breach disclosure as part of that review. But there's still quite a way for that to go, and it has to work its way through Parliament. And I think there are some pretty difficult public policy choices to consider as we do that.
All right, I'm going to wrap it there. Thank you very much. Please acknowledge our panel today.